Hi, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today, my guest is Kevin D. Williamson. He's a roving correspondent for the National Review and the author of, most recently, Big White Ghetto. Kevin, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hi, thanks.
So I didn't warn you, but I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. On this podcast, the guests introduce themselves. I could read your bio. I could give all the names of your titles of your different books. But imagine you've arrived at a dinner party or some other event and you don't know anyone and you're called on to introduce yourself. Please do so.
Well, if I'm at a dinner party or some other event where I don't know anyone, I will do my usual thing and not introduce myself and try not to talk to people if it's at all avoidable. I'm not a super sociable guy. No, so I'm a writer for National Review and a writer of books about politics. And before that, I spent most of my career as a newspaper editor in India at the very beginning of it, and then mostly for small town newspapers in the United States. I had the bad business decision to start a daily newspaper once in Philadelphia, which didn't work out especially well, but it was a lot of fun. And I've been with National Review for, I guess 12 years now, something like that. So I write, I don't really write about politics when I can avoid it. Anyway, I mean, every 4 years I'll go out and write something about a presidential campaign or something like that. But I tend to spend more time writing about policy stuff and social issues. And I like to do these long reported pieces where I spend some time in a place and have a lot of conversations with the people who actually live and work there and try to write something that's a little more in-depth and informed about just what their lives are like and what their situation is like, which doesn't necessarily always lend itself to a political point. It's not always, and therefore vote for this guy, or and therefore pass this bill or don't pass this bill, because life is really more complicated than I think our binary political conversation allows for.
Well, let's follow up on that, and I'll give the full title of your book, which came out in the end of November 2020, if I remember correctly. It's called Big White Ghetto: Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage in the Dank Woolly Wilds of the Real America. Not sure how you got that long of a title past your editor, but congratulations.
They like long subtitles.
Okay.
Political books, particularly conservative political books, it's all about the subtitle. I mean,
yeah. Look
at anything that's being published by, Regnery, anything you're hearing about on talk radio. I mean, maybe not quite as long a subtitle as I have, but they'll have some significant subtitles there.
Fair enough.
Because book marketing always works the same way. I mean, the unusual thing about my title is there's 3 words in it instead of 1. Normally it's 1 word, betrayal, something like that, and then how Barack Obama,
the front seat on the history of the presidential
the American dream, and sold it to the Chinese, but that's not really so much what I do.
Well, so let's talk about that, because when reading Big White Ghetto, and then I also was looking at your other book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism. You do spend a lot of time in parts of the U.S. where a lot of journalists don't go, and particularly in rural America. And it was one of the things in particular in Big White Ghetto that you go to rural towns. And it's one of the things that as I look at America today and think about what's going on, the political divide is real, but the urban rural divide is maybe even broader. How do you see that? Because I mean, you've spent a lot of time, you part of your career, you grew up part of your life in Lubbock, you've moved around the country a lot. So is it that this is something that you feel compelled to cover? How do you see that divide, and do you think it's getting worse?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to that. So, I don't really come from a rural background. I come from sort of a rural adjacent background. I was amused in the news last week where they were talking about this socialist lady who's been elected the new mayor of Buffalo. And she's the first socialist mayor of a big city in the United States in X number of years or whatever. Like, Buffalo, is that really a big city now? Because no one thinks of Lubbock as a big city, and it's got more people than Buffalo does. Buffalo, of course.
Is that right? I didn't realize that. Okay. Yeah.
So it's 250,000, 300,000 college town, surrounded by a whole lot of nothing, cotton farming, mostly other kinds of farming. So there is some, interplay between the, kind of the heartland of progressive America, which is the university town, and the heartland of right-wing America, which is the farm. They all kind of come together there where I'm from. So I suppose I grew up with a foot in both worlds. I've spent a lot of time writing about, essentially poor white people and drug addicted white people. Because I don't think there are a lot of people, for one reason, because I don't think there are a lot of people who do a good job of writing about that stuff. It's funny, this piece I wrote that the book takes its name from, where I spent some time in Owsley County, Kentucky. It's funny down there. So Owsley County is sort of famous because usually when the census numbers come out every 10 years, it's the poorest place in America. It's the poorest county in the United States.
Right.
And the poorest census denominated place. I mean, there are poor areas in big cities and such, but it's the poorest census denominated place. So because journalists, including me, are lazy and lack imagination, a lot of people just go, well, here's the poorest place in the country. Let's go there and see what's going on, write about it. So the local people down there, you talk to the police chief or the mayor or the local business leaders, they've met sort of every journalist in America. You had the New York Times down here last week and the Washington Post the week before that, and some guy from the Atlantic, and CBS Evening News was down here, and yada yada yada.
And they get their dose of poverty porn and leave.
Well, I don't want to say that, because I don't think this stuff is written in bad faith, and I don't think that it's even necessarily lazy. Although there's kind of a write about the tallest building, write about the biggest lake, write about the deepest hole, write about the poorest place, write about the richest place. And I read about the richest place in America too. I read about Fisher Island, Florida, which is a whole kind of other interesting, strange little world. But I think generally a lot of journalists do a good job of writing about that world, because they don't know very much about it, because they don't really mostly come from the white underclass, which is what we're really writing about. And their lack of personal connection to that world causes them to, I think, overperform sympathy. They write about this stuff in a kind of, I think, overly charitable way sometimes, in a way that, is sentimental, that romanticizes poverty and the many afflictions that go along with it, that in some ways denies people responsibility and agency for their own lives, by looking for stories about, well, what happened to these people? Why did they end up this way? And that was really an interesting thing to me about Owsley County, is that nothing happened to it. It's not like it's some Midwestern steel mill town where the local employer went out of business and then it became, poor and destitute because there was no economic activity. It's nothing like that happened there. It's kind of always been a poor place. And it's just that its poverty becomes more pronounced by comparison, as the rest of the country gets wealthier and more connected and more globalized, for lack of a better word. So we've got these little pockets, including a lot of places that I'm familiar with, that are in some ways cut off from the national economy, in many ways cut off from an increasingly globalized economy, that are cut off from the mainstreams of culture in some ways, that lack a ready local labor supply, even if there were someone who wanted to invest there. It's one of the things we talked about in Eastern Kentucky, is that if Apple or Google or somebody or Amazon wanted to build a facility there, they'd have to import most of the workers, because they wouldn't have people there who could do their jobs. Even though there's a lot of unemployment, it's not unemployment among the sort of people who are just waiting for a $115,000 a year skilled blue collar job to come along. So these end up being complicated problems, and I think that they are distorted by our sentimentality and our tendency to romanticize poverty and things associated with it. So I try to write about these things without that.
And how much of that is
makes me unpopular.
Well, and fair enough. But Big White Ghetto includes some parts of it are part memoir, and you're talking about your own childhood and growing up, and that you write about these rural areas in a very sympathetic way. I think in a way that's not, as you say, judgmental, but how much of that is because of your own background and because of who you are and where you came from?
Yeah, I'm not sure if sympathetic is exactly the right word for that. Okay. If it is, I'll try to correct it.
Give me a better word.
It's informed, I think, is what it is. It's I'm able to write about this stuff, I think, to a certain extent. I don't want to oversell my own experience, but to a certain extent, I'm able to write about these things with a bit of an insider's view, at least an insider's view. It's really based in experience in the 1970s, 1980s. A lot has changed among, in the world of poverty since then. I think it's very different to be a poor person in rural America now, or in, sort of semi-rural or rural adjacent America now, than it was when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s for various reasons. Partly having to do with a greater connectivity through social media and things like that. I don't, I find myself almost subconsciously quoting my father talking about growing up in the Depression. And the great cliche you always hear from people who grew up, particularly in farm country, was, well, we didn't know we were poor because everyone else was just like us. And yeah, we didn't have indoor plumbing, and we had, one pair of shoes. This is my father, not me. And if you outgrew that pair of shoes over the course of the year, then you went barefoot because you weren't getting another one until the next school year started. And all that kind of, Depression era cliche stuff, which happens to be true. But everyone they knew was pretty much in the same situation. And I think now, with a much more connected world we have, people are more conscious of their own situation, conscious of their own relative poverty, conscious of opportunities that they're missing. So I think that in some ways it's a better time. Well, in most ways it's a better time. If you're someone who has some academic promise or some scholastic ability, this is a much better time in lots of ways because you're more aware of the resources that are available to you. It's easier to connect with people and institutions, mentors, financial aid, all that kind of stuff. It's a lot easier to figure out now than it would have been in the 1970s, early 1980s. But culturally, in some ways, we're in a worse position because we've become, I think, even more materialistic than we were then. And I don't mean materialistic in the sense of, just consumerism, but in the sense of defining ourselves and our happiness in consumption terms. Exclusively. I mean, I think those things are important. I think the people who sneer at affluence and comfort are not to be trusted. These are worthwhile things and worthwhile to pursue, but they have to be part of a bigger and more integrated worldview that includes other sources of meaning, belonging, and happiness and relationship.
Well, let's come back to that in a minute, because that idea of the divide and that lack of belonging, I think it's. I was interviewing a theologian recently, and we were talking about the decline in church membership in active faith institutions. That in 20 years, it's declined by 20 points in America, and that this lack of belonging. But you referenced that in Big White Ghetto, and you say you were talking about your parents or your family. You said they were anti-elitist before it was fashionable. FDR Democrats who grew into Buchananism and Perotism before those became Trumpism.
Yeah.
So, but you mentioned that idea that in some ways the cultural divide is worse, but is because the people who are living in rural or rural adjacent areas, their unhappiness, their disdain for the elites has grown because they are more aware of it. Is that?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's part of it. One thing I should say about what I was saying earlier is we all tend to get overwhelmed by our own point of view. And so I was mentioning that, it's probably a better time to be academically gifted in a situation like that because you've got more opportunity to get out. But most people in that situation aren't. Most people who are, born into poverty are people of average intelligence and ability like anyone else. And these new ways of connecting and communicating aren't really going to help them the way they would help other sorts of people. So Charles Murray's written something about this, that, standardized testing was the best thing that ever happened to people of his generation. Because if you were reasonably smart and applied yourself, you would go take a test and you would sort of be on the radar, and people would go out of their way to sort of help you and cultivate you and help you to grow and thrive. But that's not really an option for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are just not going to thrive in an economy in a world that is the one that we have, which provides tremendous rewards to certain kinds of intellectual skills, certain kinds of abilities to manipulate symbols and language, certain kinds of social skills, and that doesn't, even under the best of circumstances now, really offer a lot in terms of material rewards for other kinds of work. So, and that's not something that's really, I think, amenable to policy change. It's just the nature of the world and the way it is. And I think that complicates the conversation somewhat, but I'm getting a little abstract here.
Well, so let's talk about that then, because in reading Big White Ghetto and looking at the politically incorrect guide to socialism, you underscore a lot of these divides. What divide in America, or what divisions in America concern you the most?
Yeah, well, I guess what concerns me is that we have these sort of neatly overlapping, mutually reinforcing distinctions. So if you lay the political map over the religious map, over the rural versus urban map, over the upwardly mobile versus stagnant or downwardly mobile map, you'll see a lot of overlap in those areas and those categories. So you have people who are, in areas that are where there are relatively low levels of education, where there are relatively low levels of economic mobility, but maybe very high levels of religiosity, high levels of this kind of populist nationalist political sentiment. And these things all end up kind of reinforcing each other because they all can be interpreted to support this narrative of victimhood, that things would be great for you if not for the elites or the Chinese or free trade or the universities or the biased media or this, that, or the other. And if you take it to the extreme, you get the kind of QAnon, Luciferian, pedophile cult stuff. But it's all essentially the same story. You just get less outrageous and more outrageous versions of the same story. And one of my little truisms that I think about a lot as I write, and I've never really put this in a way I'm completely satisfied with, but there are a lot of things in your life that are not your fault that are still your problem because there's no one else there to deal with them. And this is true of individuals, it's true of communities, it's true of various social groupings, classes, economic groups. The fact that you don't have 100% autonomy and 100% control over your life, your condition, your situation, your circumstances, that other people and agencies and institutions can't act on you in ways that harm your interests, doesn't divest you of being the party who's principally responsible for your own life. There's unfairness in the world. We all kind of know this. It's something we talk about with children, that life's not fair, but you still got to do your homework and you still got to eat your vegetables and you still got to do your chores and clean your room and all the rest of the stuff. But we seem to kind of forget that when we're dealing with adults, that well, yes, life's not fair, and maybe you're in an industry, or we're in an industry that has been negatively affected by globalization or offshoring or things like that. It doesn't mean that we're without sympathy for these folks. It doesn't mean there aren't things that we could do to help them, because there are. But ultimately, you have to be responsible for yourself. I really don't see any place to start. And this has been sort of a 10-year debate now between my friend Michael Brendan Doherty and myself, that conservatives of his stripe want a more kind of activist and solidarity-based model of government and a model of public policy. And I think there's some room for that. But ultimately, we're either going to have people in communities that are financially and morally self-sufficient, or they're going to be maintained in some sort of dependency indefinitely. And I'm just not open to the second option. I don't think that maintaining any significant part of the society in indefinite dependency is a very healthy or practicable thing. Now, of course, you're always going to have the issue of dependency with children, with people who have various kinds of profound disabilities who just can't manage their own lives. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about largely able-bodied adults who are able to work, who don't have maybe a lot of skills, and who are, modest in their personal endowments. But that's really the group that we're dealing with, and that we have to think about how to get them to serve their own interests and pursue their own interests in a way that is more effective than they have been in the last 30 or 40 years.
So when you're saying that, Kevin, what I'm hearing, or what going through my head, is that you're arguing against this idea that government's going to be able to cure everything, and that people are going to have to be more self-reliant. That this is fundamentally what I hear your argument there, and I agree with it. But I hear at the same time, in the broader culture, this elaboration of victimhood on all kinds of different levels, and identity politics, and going exactly the other direction from that. And so is there a way, who's addressing this in a way that makes sense to you in the political sphere today? Or is it just being completely ignored?
Yeah. American government is essentially 90% of it's a jobs program. The other 10%, half of it's the military and half of it's a bank. So we're sort
and the rhetoric from the Biden administration is we're going to get more jobs. We're going to change this.
The same as the rhetoric from any other
jobs, and particularly when it comes to the energy business, right, which is what I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, but I mean, we see the same from Republican administrations too, where they think that the purpose of the economy and of businesses and industries is to create jobs and employ people, and it's not. That's a side effect. The purpose of the energy industry is to create energy. The purpose of manufacturing is to manufacture whatever it is that they manufacture. The fact that this creates employment and spreads around wealth in the form of wages and benefits and other things is great. That's natural. We should certainly try to encourage that, but we can't proceed as though that is an end in and of itself. Otherwise, you end up in the situation where we are with a lot of federal programs and local programs now, which is essentially some sophisticated variation on paying someone to dig a hole and fill it up. We have a lot of, kind of make work stuff. Let's protect this industry, right, even though it's not really economically viable anymore. Let's see if we can get another 5 or 10 years out of it through whatever, protectionism, subsidy, that sort of thing. We do this a lot with government work. And this is one of those things where you can really see where the power is in society by whose interests get served. So if you look at the public school systems, they are run by and for the benefit of relatively high income, college educated people. That's who runs the schools. And we treat public education and a lot of state and local government essentially as a jobs program for above average income, though not very wealthy, but certainly above average income, college educated people. And the people who most need what public schools should be doing, who are largely poor people without a lot of choices about how and where they're educated, who desperately need to develop their abilities to the greatest extent that's possible, we don't serve their interests at all because we're treating this as a jobs program for the people who work at the schools rather than treating it as something that actually serves the interests of the families and students who are in those schools. And
so you have the situation where the teacher unions were arguing, we'll keep the schools closed for extended periods, regardless of COVID, et
every
cetera.
argument against school choice, teacher accountability, any sort of flexibility, charter schools, all this stuff is based on a model of the public schools as a jobs program for the upper middle class, which is what they are.
So let me ask you this, one of the questions. So how do you describe your politics? How would you describe yourself in the political spectrum, and where do you fit in?
Sure. I mean, you're probably libertarian for lack of a better term. What I try to do in my writing is I'm a lot more interested in trying to describe what's actually going on in the world than I am in saying, well, here's what we should do.
Right.
Or here's why this ideology is right and that ideology is not right. So I'm a conservative in the sense that I prefer things that are familiar and effective and proven to things that are newfangled and complicated and that often don't work. So, politically, I think you would say that, I'm a classical liberal in my idea of how I think government should be organized and what government's relation to the individual should be. Socially, in terms of how I think people will be happy living, I'm very conservative in that way. I think that a lot of unhappiness in life comes from our inability to make and sustain good decisions about marriage, family, child rearing, that sort of thing. Not all of it, obviously, but that's a big part of it. And that we have various social and economic incentives that are stacked against doing the things that will actually make people happy on that front. We've got.
So you're talking in some ways, what I'm hearing you say there is, pointing to some of this breakdown in society is the breakdown of the family, which is a point that's been made over and over again.
I think most men and women would be better off getting married younger, having children younger, if they had the sorts of families and communities that could really support them in the way that they needed. And this isn't something the government can do. This is something about how we live, not about how we govern. We get a lot of people who are unhappy because they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, and they still haven't really, settled down in a particular way in life. Maybe they have some kids, but they've got a real disorderly family life, and maybe no relationship with the other parent. And this ends up, creating a great deal of chaos that is something you can deal with if you've got a lot of resources.
Right.
If you're really, really skilled, you're really, really high income, or you just inherited a ton of money or something like that, you can deal with a fair bit of chaos in your personal life. If you're a lawyer who makes $500,000 a year, $800,000 a year, mid-range lawyer, and you develop a drug addiction problem, you can deal with that. It's still a terrible thing. Addiction's a real hard thing, even if you have money, but it's a lot easier to deal with a problem like that if you've got some resources, financial and otherwise, to throw at it. I have a dear friend who actually runs addiction programs for lawyers. That's his whole business, and you'd be just shocked by how big a problem it is in the legal profession. But you take that same addiction or that same sort of dysfunction and you give it to someone who's got no job or an income of $12,000 or $15,000 a year, 3 kids and a real disorderly family life, a couple of criminal convictions. That person's going to have a lot harder time with it. So one of the downsides of this kind of liberationist culture that we got from the 1960s and 1970s is that we kind of transferred the worst aspects of family and personal life from the upper classes to the people who can least afford them. So, it used to be that, when people in Hollywood lived a certain kind of way, yeah, we all thought it was kind of fun because we'd read about it in the newspapers, and it was sort of depraved because it was all so awful. But it was a small group of people who had a lot of money and resources.
And they were getting divorced and having affairs and
right, yeah. And now that sort of lifestyle has become sort of a norm for people who really can't afford it. So I guess this is my way of saying, from an economic point of view, depravity is just another luxury good. You have to have some resources before you can have it.
Never heard it put that way. Depravity is a luxury good. Well, so let me shift gears here a little bit, Kevin, because you've had you've been in journalism a long time. I've done journalism for a while as well. You've done theater criticism. Recently, you've written about foreign affairs. You wrote a piece about Japan and Taiwan and having their need to stand up to China. You've written about inflation, critical race theory, the imperial president. How do you decide on what topics you cover?
Well, my deal with National Review is a great one. I've got kind of the best job in journalism. So my arrangement with National Review is I can pretty well write about whatever I want to, as long as I write a whole lot of it. So, I write 5 to 7 articles a week for the website, the magazine, and other stuff. And that's a lot of output. I write something like 1 million words a year if you count, books and other work that I do. So the good news is that gives me a lot of opportunity to write about a lot of different things. And my interests, change over the years. I have been writing a lot more about foreign policy and international relations in the last couple of years, and particularly in the last few months. I think that the competition between the United States and China is really going to be the most important issue in the world in the next 50 years or so. I don't think the United States has the resources to sustain this competition successfully on its own. So I think it's very important that we rebuild and strengthen and reinvigorate our alliances abroad, particularly with Europe and the United Kingdom, but also with our North American neighbors and some others. I think that, populism and economic nationalism have made this very, very difficult. You'll notice that, Joe Biden, who goes around talking about how he wants to undo everything Donald Trump ever did, is keeping the tariffs in place and is not really that interested toward in expanding trade relationships or liberalizing trade relationships between the United States and Europe, because apparently we're worried about being taken advantage of by those low-wage slave laborers in Germany, which is really not the case.
The slave labor in China is clear and has a big role in the solar energy sector. So
yeah, that's true. China is a difficult situation. So I think that I wish I spoke Chinese. We got several people at National Review who do, and I'm not one of them though. But I think that in general, American media coverage of China is not very good. It takes an overly simplistic point of view. You either get a kind of economist style of maybe I'm being unfair to the economist in this, but of treating China as a more or less normal country at a certain point in its economic development, even though it's got political institutions that we don't approve of and hope liberalize. It's more or less on the same path or a similar path to what we'd expect from other countries. Or you have the kind of more common on the conservative side, sort of demonistic view of China. It's super bad, and everything about it must be opposed in every way. I think both of those are simplistic and not especially fruitful ways of looking at it. China's got a horrific government. They are the worst government in the world, probably, certainly because they inflict so much misery on such a large population, and they're just absolutely ruthless. And they are technologically innovative, so they're coming up with new ways to oppress and exclude and harass and punish and torture people.
By the way, I'm just sorry to interrupt, but did you see the piece recently about the lying down movement in China, that the censors, some guy had come up with, well, I'm working too hard, and he just started doing a blog about lying down and just taking it easy, and he was censored for it. And I thought, wow, now that has your censor button. I mean, you're using that a little too much. How much of a threat is this to order? And yet we're censoring them because you're not helping the Chinese state to grow and thrive. I thought, wow.
Yeah, well, it's a huge threat for them, though. Think about it. If there's a real serious recession in the United States next year, that means maybe Joe Biden doesn't get reelected, or his party gets a beating in the midterms. If there's a real serious economic downturn in China, it does not end in an election. It ends in something very, very different for these guys, and they know it. There's no retirement program for dictators. There's no old folks home for autocrats. You rule until you get the Ceausescu treatment eventually, or the Saddam Hussein treatment, and they know this. But the other thing that I think we misunderstand about China is that it's not just this Orwellian dictatorial police state imposing its will on a hapless and docile population. There is a great deal of buy-in from the Chinese people to their model of government. This nationalism that we see from the Chinese is partly the product of propaganda, but it's also partly organic and genuine. This sense of China's internal sense of its own uniqueness and its place in the world is not something that comes from the Communist Party. It's something the Communist Party inherited from very, very long and well-established Chinese political history. So there even is, in a way, a sense of accountability, I think, in China, that the government believes, even though there aren't elections and things like that, that it has certain deliverables that it has to make good on for the people. And these aren't just economic growth and jobs and wages. There are other things as well. They're, order and a sense of national self-respect, and a number of these things that China feels like it was denied for centuries. So I think that we don't do a very good job of writing about China or talking about China. I've spent almost no time there, a couple of days in Hong Kong, so I'm far from being an expert on the subject. But
it's interesting but it's interesting to me that you're covering that, and given that how broad your portfolio has been. Yeah. Well, let me reach back, because I write a little bit, but 1 million words a year is a lot. I mean, how do you maintain that level of output? And I ask that just on as a someone who's in the business, because my back, my elbows, it's a tremendous physical feat as well as mental. No, how do you manage the workload?
I'm a pretty fast writer, so I come to that number from thinking something on the order of 3,500 words a day on average. So I think that comes out to around 1 million words a year. There are days when I'll sit down and I'll write 15, 20,000 words at a sitting.
Day?
Sure. Yeah. Sometimes.
Wow. Okay.
If I'm really, on a roll about something. It's funny, that socialism book I wrote, which I like the book, don't get me wrong. It's, but it's kind of a superficial book in some ways. It's kind of a primer. It's got pictures in it and stuff, and little breakout charts and things like that. By far the best-selling book I've written, I think. It actually came up in the news this week too, with the Pemex stuff in Mexico, because there's a chapter in it about the environmental record of, state-run enterprises, which is pretty
Right.
bad. But yeah, I think I wrote that in, I don't know, 27 days, something like that. So I wrote that pretty quickly. So some of my stuff, I'm sure some people will say, yeah, and it reads like you wrote it in 27 days too. But probably get that sometimes. But
which inevitably brings up, that's not writing, that's typing, right?
Yeah. One of my favorite sneers was someone once referred to Stephen King as the horror typist.
Yeah, nice.
I thought that was pretty good.
Was it Truman Capote talking about Kerouac? What was that? That's not writing, that's typing. Anyway, but
yeah.
Well, so what
the best insult I ever got was from the late Mike Patemra, who was National Review's literary editor for a long time. And I turned in what was for me an unusually kind of dry piece. And he said, "That's all right, Kevin. Even Tom Wolfe doesn't try to write like Tom Wolfe all the time."
Well, so what motivates that level of output? I mean, because when I read, and I'm an admirer, I'm a fan, and I've thought about having you on the podcast for some time, but I'm impressed by your output. I'm impressed by the level of intellectual rigor you bring to it. And when I read your work, I think, well, there's some whimsy in it. There's some amusement, but there's a fair amount of disgust or dismay.
More than there should be, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, anger motivates a lot of what I write. I mean, there's just, and frustration with the foolishness of some of the ventures. But can you put your finger on it? What motivates you to do this in such a all-encompassing way? Because it sure sounds like it is.
Yeah, well, I don't play golf.
Well, it's a good walk spoiled. I don't either.
I like golf. I've played once or twice, but I got nothing else to do all day, except write. And so I'm very lucky to have the kind of job where I can do what I do. So I tend to fill up 8 or 10 hours a day doing it most of the time, although a lot of that's, reading and not writing, or, having conversations with people and that sort of thing. There is more disgust in my work than I would like, I think. And that's that kind of, it's a little bit of an intellectual cop-out on my part, I think. I think it's a real weakness, something I've been trying to work on. And it's part of my character that, if I found $100 million on my porch tomorrow morning, would I still write 6 columns a week? Probably wouldn't. I'd probably go buy a villa on Lake Como and, write maybe a weekly column.
And hang with George Clooney. Yeah.
Yeah, do some novels and stuff. Yeah, I went there on my honeymoon, but we did not run into the Clooneys. So maybe they weren't there for that part of the season. Yeah, so part of it's just that's how I make my living. If you're a football player, you get up and you play football every day. If you're a lawyer, you get up and do whatever it is lawyers do all day. I've never really quite figured that out. Do you ever try to figure out what someone actually does for a living? I remember when I was a newspaper editor in Philadelphia, there was a guy I knew there who had this just magnificent house. It was, in the main line, the Philadelphia suburbs. It was probably on about 15 acres that looked like a park, just beautiful. It was his old 18th century stone house. Not really my taste, but just, wonderful place, 15,000 square foot house. He had horses and stuff. And I was like, I need to know, what do you do that generates the kind of income where you can live like this? And he said, well, Kevin, you know what I do? I'm the president of, XYZ Bank. I said, well, I know what your job title is. I know where you work and what they call you, but what do you do all day? What do you actually do? And he was actually able to explain it to me reasonably well. But I'm often mystified by what people actually do all day, which is kind of one of the genres I write about. I will go write about business people typically, or other kinds of, or business enterprises, and try to figure out what they're all about. I've written a couple of pieces about the oil and gas industry that you probably have read, that I think is just really interesting because it's not what you expect.
Right.
I'm growing up in West Texas. I think of the oil industry as being, J.R. Ewing and guys in white Stetsons, Cadillacs. And I love the fact that in the 1960s, there was a Rolls-Royce dealership in Midland, Texas, of all places. But it's really changed since then. It's a very kind of nerd industry now.
A very kind of
industry.
What was that word that you used?
It's a nerd industry. It's run by engineers, science guys and stuff.
Right. Oh yeah.
And they got work boots and stuff on, and maybe they don't shave every day, so they're kind of scruffy looking engineers. they're definitely nerds. They're
Yeah.
definitely guys who know their Star Trek from their Star Wars, I think,
Sure.
and have seen all the Lord of the Rings movies. I mean, they're nerds, the guys who run the oil business these days. And I kind of like that about them. It's sort of a fun business. It's got this kind of, rough blue collar reputation, and it is still that business in some ways, but at its upper levels, it's culturally very, very different from what one expects.
Well,
So,
can I interrupt you on that?
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Well, can I interrupt you on that cultural part of that? Because to me, I live in Austin and I grew up in Oklahoma. So, being around oil field people and seeing that industry all my career, I'm familiar with it. But there is the divide, particularly one of the starkest divides that I see in the United States is over energy policy, and who's going to be allowed to produce and what kind of energy we're going to use. And you mentioned China before, and I've been writing about this recently, but this idea for almost all my adult life, Congress has been promulgating policy opposed to foreign commodities, right? And OPEC, and we're gonna teach the OPEC a lesson. And then the shale revolution comes on. Suddenly, OPEC isn't as relevant as it was, and yet now here comes the Biden administration, apparently wanting to give hamstring the domestic industry, the domestic oil and gas industry, while going with all this green technologies that's going to refer back to China in terms of supply chain issues, which to me, on a strategic standpoint, makes no sense at all. But there's a fundamental issue here in terms of coastal elites. And I don't use that, we don't like that phrase, but that's in fact appropriate here in the kind of disdain they have for oil and gas and an apparent preference for these technologies that we're going to acquire imports of massive quantities of materials that we don't produce.
Yeah.
How do you parse that?
Well, first of all, I think, someone who's lived in Oklahoma and Texas, or Oklahoma and Austin, you're a guy who's lived in two places where he can see Texas, but isn't actually in Texas. Close, but no cigar in both situations.
And you're in Dallas, right? You live in Dallas now.
Yeah, I went to school in Austin.
Yeah, right. No, I knew that. Yeah.
I used to think I really liked Austin, but I think I just liked being 20, as it turns out. It's a different thing. So yeah, the regulation and the economic incentives and subsidies and all the stuff that having to do with traditional hydrocarbon energy versus so-called renewables is a super complicated issue. And a couple of things about that. One is that energy independence is just a nonsensical expression, and I want to smack people every time they say it. There's no such thing as energy independence, not even for the United States, not even now. Our so-called oil and gas independence is really North American, not the United States. And the more you look into the industry, you see all these interesting things. I always thought it was weird that Iran, which is this petroleum powerhouse, has to import all of its gasoline because it doesn't have any refineries, or at least it didn't. I guess it's built some in recent years. So it's a super complicated business. We produce all this oil and gas, but we still have to import tons of oil because of the way our refineries are configured. We talk about solar as though it's this, pristine thing. And what are solar panels made out of? They're made out of, polyester, which is made out of oil. Right. It's all these things end up being interrelated with one another. One of the things I've tried to drive in this conversation, at least to get people to understand at some level, is that there is no such thing as clean energy. Every source of energy is going to have some kind of environmental externalities. Some of them are better than others, and some of them are worse than others. But when it comes to, for instance, natural gas and fracking, most people don't really even understand what the real environmental problem is there, which is wastewater.
Right.
It's the water that comes back up out of the well that brings all sorts of nasty stuff from deep underground with it. And as it turns out, we've actually got pretty good ways for dealing with that problem. They're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And they certainly were not very good 30 years ago when they were essentially just diluting the wastewater and dumping it in rivers and streams.
Right.
Not oil and gas explorers, by the way. That was mostly local governments doing that. They would, the local municipal wastewater treatment facility would just dilute it to whatever level was legally acceptable to dump and then dump it. And that obviously wasn't a good way to do it. So they've come up with ways to recycle fracking fluids and fracking water and that sort of thing. And that's all, really very good and useful. So when you look at this stuff from more, I hate the word holistic, but I guess here it fits, point of view, which includes the politics as well. oil and gas looks a lot more attractive, I think, than its critics give it credit for. Now, I'm a huge fan of solar and wind power and all the rest of this stuff. I think it's got some great applications. There are places where it really matters. I like electric cars, not so much because I for environmental reasons, it's because they're awesome for the most part. And Tesla makes just wonderful cars, and they're quiet, which I also appreciate because I hate noise. And but there's not this simplistic sort of thing where we can just say, well, we're going to stop doing this and start doing that, without looking at the real physical limitations on that. We're always talking about infrastructure. There are limits to what we can do for that other stuff right now, just in terms of physical plants and such things that'll have to be built, and that takes resources to do too. And these things tend to be made of things like steel and concrete, which bring with them a lot of environmental costs,
and copper and lithium and neodymium and all
the rest of it.
Well, let me interrupt you there for a moment, because you also in the politically incorrect guide to socialism, you mentioned the interview you had with Boone Pickens, which I thought was funny. And we
almost got in a fight. Yeah,
I could tell the story, but you wrote it in a very Boone's passed now, and he's from Holdenville, Oklahoma, and he's just. And I had several exchanges with him. But explain what you were talking to him about. His desire in the Pickens plan and his desire for natural gas trucks. Do you remember that video?
Yeah,
because it seems to me the socialism in the energy business is the point that I'm getting to here.
I was born in Amarillo, by the way, where the name Boone Pickens is not worth very much. He is not remembered fondly. So Pickens and the so-called Pickens plan was something he thought up when he discovered that he owned a whole bunch of natural gas and wasn't having much luck selling it at prices that he wanted to sell it at. So the Pickens plan was going to be to pass a federal law requiring all long-haul trucks and freight trucks to convert to natural gas, liquefied natural gas or compressed natural gas, I forget which one, instead of diesel. And then this is going to cost, the better part of $1 trillion to convert the entire fleet. So have the federal government pay them to do it. And so it's the great, let's spend $1 trillion buying stuff that Boone Pickens has a whole lot of plan. I think the world would be better off if people bought more books and read more magazines. And, maybe if the federal government wants to buy everyone in the United States a subscription to National Review, great.
You'd be in favor. How shocking.
I'd be in favor, sure, but let's not pretend like it's anything other than naked self-interest there. And so he and I were talking about this at National Review's office in New York, and I was making fun of him. I was like, this is the most self-serving, ridiculous, transparent thing I've ever heard in my life. How are you actually going to walk into Washington and try to sell this to people with a straight face? And he said, you must be in favor of foreign oil. I'm in favor of buying oil from whoever's got it. And, gas too.
And you pointed out that the subsidy was going to be something like $65,000 per truck or something to that effect, which was
huge figure.
Roughly equal to the median household income in the United States.
Yeah, more actually at that time. So yeah, it was a ridiculous boondoggle, but this sort of stuff comes up a lot when you give people powers over markets and powers over, vast swaths of the economy and reorganizing them according to their own, desires. And you have to watch out for this, not only with the environmental movement, which certainly has financial self-interests that are attached to it, but, all these, economic patriotism, economic nationalism, all that kind of stuff. We spend just a tremendous amount of effort and money protecting Americans from low prices and abundance. We have to keep that Canadian timber out of here, because if so, well, gosh, then it'll be cheaper to build a house and housing prices might go down.
Some sawmill somewhere might be put out of business because the Canadian timber's cheaper, right?
Yeah. And it's always, when it's politics, we're always talking about, being victimized either by the Chinese or by Latin American workers. But in real life, it's always, it's the nefarious Canadians.
Right. Yeah,
and the race to the bottom Germans.
Canadians are a dangerous bunch, though.
And the corporate tax shelter guys in Ireland. These are not poor countries. These are not dictatorships. These are perfectly normal, capitalist countries that we deal with. It's funny. One of the things I like to look at is if you look at on a state-by-state basis what every state's biggest overseas trading partner is. And if you took each state as an individual country, what would its biggest bilateral trade partner be? And you won't be surprised, of course, but a whole lot of them are Mexico and Canada, because we buy stuff from them, they buy stuff from us. Right. We're close together, so there's transportation cost issues and things like that. But I love that in Nevada, where I used to live, and I'm a huge fan of Nevada, its biggest overseas trading partner is what I think is the best governed country in the world, which is Switzerland. And as it turns out, Nevada produces a lot of gold and silver, and the Swiss buy a lot of it because they've got essentially a metals-backed currency regime.
Right, I see.
And also the Swiss sell a lot of wristwatches, and people tend to buy them in Las Vegas, which is where, 9 out of, some huge number of Rolexes and Pateks and things like that are sold in Las Vegas. So everything gets more complicated the more you know about it. And everything's real simple, provided you don't know anything about it.
That's well put. Everything gets more complicated the more you know about it. Well, is that when it would be, going back to your earlier discussion about this, because I think there is some creeping socialism in how the government is being run, that every industry wants just a little carve out, just a little thing. Is that, how much of a concern is that for you? Because I'm bullish. Well, I'll ask the question first, because how bullish are you on the United States?
Actively shopping for real estate abroad.
Now you say that with a smile. Are you serious?
Yeah.
You think the decline, the American decline has started, or is already well underway?
Well, we are an unstable society, I think, and
unstable because of all these divisions that we've been talking about.
Well, because we have essentially a non-functioning central government and increasingly non-functional state and local governments. My desire to be out of the United States, at least for some period of time, is more cultural than anything else. I'm not expecting, civil war, blood in the streets, or anything like that, at least not anytime in the immediate future. But we're a deeply troubled society that has lost its way in many ways, and that I'm not entirely convinced is going to be able to find its way back.
And that rings true to me. And I'm bullish on the U.S. I think we have a lot of intrinsic strengths, but there are a lot of things that are happening now that are really tearing it apart. But let's move on to one thing that your career, and recently you've been a theater critic, and I haven't seen things lately that you've written about the theater, but I really enjoyed the piece that you wrote back in 2013. And this is a great line: "The power of theater comes from its ability to surprise."
Yeah.
And that resonated with me, and it brought to mind, it's a long time ago here in Austin, I saw a version of Camelot, and Richard Harris was in the cast, and someone came on stage and he, saluted the king or something, and he pressed his armor, and the piece of armor fell on the stage. Right. And there's, of course, it's the surprise, like, this isn't supposed to happen. Right. And so there's this, from the audience, and this kind of pause. And then Harris says something to the effect of, "Well, I hope your valor is greater than the strength of your armor," or something. Just a complete ad-libbed line. Yeah. But that's a long intro to the point about you famously taking the cell phone from the woman next to you and tossing it into the aisle, and then being ejected from the theater. And you said there was a moment of wonderful, shocked silence. And I think I'm responding to this because you did what a lot of us would like to do. She salvaged such self-respect as she could, which is to say, she slapped me, and then stalked off in search of her phone. A few minutes later, I was visited by an annoyed gentleman in a black suit, and soon enough found myself out on the street. Yes, it was worth it.
The New York Post endorsed me for mayor of New York after that.
Is that right?
I was not running in the race. But,
you were not running, but that vignette speaks to, and then you ended the piece talking about common politeness in society, and this decline of just a basic respect for people around you. And that's one of the other things that troubles me. And has it gotten worse since you wrote that, or is this something that you see in the theater or elsewhere? This decline of just basic kind of civility?
Well, I stopped doing theater criticism when I moved out of New York, because in the United States, you really can't be a theater critic anywhere else.
Sure.
Houston, Las Vegas, they've got a lot going for them. They're great places. I love those cities, but you can't really be a theater critic there. Yeah, this particular lady, I was thinking, and I think maybe I wrote this in that piece, it's been a while, but an opera based on war and peace. If you're the sort of person who needs to be on your phone every 5 minutes, maybe that's not the show for you. Maybe Blue Man Group or something else would be, kind of more your speed.
Cirque du Soleil.
An opera based on war and peace is going to have some parts where you have to pay attention.
Right.
And in fact, that show, it's a wonderful show called Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. And it begins with this wonderful, funny chorus in which they introduce all the major characters and the single attribute of each. And the song is called It's All in Your Program. And so it goes, because it's a complicated Russian opera and it's a complicated Russian novel, and everyone's got 9 different names. So look it up in your program. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. And that's a wonderful show. But yeah, it takes some work to follow something like that. One of the problems with theater, particularly in New York, but also with movie theaters and concert venues and things like that, is that we're taking people who effectively now come from different cultures and putting them in the same space and expecting them to react the same way to the same stimulus, and that's not going to work out. So, in New York, you've got your sort of Upper West Side theater snobs who, know how to stay quiet through a show and that sort of thing. And you've got your tourists who, feel the need to take pictures or, do whatever they do on their phones. I don't know what people actually do on their phones that they can't turn them off for a couple of hours. I remember I saw Emilia Clarke, the lady from Game of Thrones, in a stage play of Breakfast at Tiffany's. And miserable, by the way. She's a terrible actress. Although I like Game of Thrones, she's truly, truly awful. And she was in the role of Holly Golightly. And there's a scene in which she's briefly naked on the stage. She drops a robe and steps into a bathtub. And the show came to a screeching halt because 600 people took out their phones to take pictures of her in this brief moment of nudity. It was like, walking into an explosion, all the flashes. And this is when Game of Thrones was still on television. I was thinking to myself, this is the nakedest woman in the world. She is naked on Game of Thrones every week. Everyone in the world who's got any sort of cable connection has seen this woman naked. You somehow feel the need to stop and take a picture in this particular context. It's weird how I react to stuff. So we've got people pushed together in ways where they're uncomfortable with one another because they've got different sets of expectations about behavior and manners and those sorts of things. And I think in a sense, that's the country writ large. You've got people who have very strong opinions about what the good life looks like, how people should behave, what's important, what's valuable, what sort of things should be valorized, what sort of things should be sneered at. And we have essentially 2 tribes that have increasingly incompatible values and incompatible preferences and incompatible aspirations in many ways as well. And it's going to be very hard to have an increasingly centralized government and keep these 2 rival tribes happy. I mean, this is why we go crazy with presidential elections, because it's the tribal
tribes,
symbol.
you're saying it's the Democrats and the Republicans, or is that the name that you would use for them, or would you say it's liberals, conservatives, rural, urban? What are the names of those tribes?
It's all those things. Democrats and Republicans is how it expresses itself in the political realm. And what's interesting about that is that we actually have wide agreement, or much wider agreement than you would expect, on a number of real hot button issues. So if you look at the Gallup polling on, say, abortion, and see what share of Americans oppose late-term abortions, 3rd trimester abortions, it's like 88% overall, including 80% of Democrats and 91% of Republicans or something like that. If you look at Americans' attitudes toward things like illegal immigration or free trade, you will actually see a great deal of agreement among people who identify as Republicans, people who identify as Democrats. Often agreement about bad policies, like Americans are generally hostile toward free trade across both parties. They both tend to support protectionism and various kinds of interventionism. So this isn't about policy disputes. This isn't about whether the top income tax rate is going to be 39% or 37%. This isn't about whether we have 7% tariff on steel imported from China or 21% tariff on steel imported from China. It's about how people see themselves, about the sort of community that they feel that they're a part of. And both sides are very anxious that we're going to have a country that doesn't reflect their values.
And how they identify as an American, right? Or whether they are we talked about China earlier. The more that sense of the country as it's their affiliation or their pride in their country. What you're saying, what I'm reflecting back, is that the tribalism, which seems to be fanned and given propane and lots of oxygen by Fox and CNN, and oh, look at how stupid those people are, that tribalism is being fed and reinforced through this the balkanization of the media. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think the balkanization of the media is more a response than a cause. I think that's just driven by people looking for market share. I think if Fox News thought it would make $10 more next year by taking a different view of something, it would. MSNBC too. How to put this? It's partly a matter of symbols and partly a matter of who we think we are. And it's funny, you talk about how we are as Americans. You see this on both sides of, we're Americans, we're proud of our country, we're patriotic, but, on the left, it's, except we're an irredeemably racist society and we hate women and we hate immigrants and we hate people who are sexually different from us and all that. And we need to basically be taken down to the studs and renovated from scratch. And then on the right, you've got these so-called nationalists and, America First people who, I love my country, except for 27 of the states, basically all the cities, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the universities, and, the parts of the country where the money and the people are. But the rest of it, is just awesome.
Right.
And so what you have here, I think, is two groups of people who are anxious about their place in the world and
eager to blame somebody else for it.
Always eager to blame someone for it. But they fundamentally have the same worry, which is that they're going to be forced to live in a context in which they are humiliated, in which they are forced to live by someone else's values, in which they are ruled over instead of ruling over others. And that's why you get all these, petty, ridiculous, symbolic disputes, like public funding of abortion, for instance, is a pretty good one. So irrespective of how you feel about abortion, if you look at the numbers, pick your favorite left-wing boogeyman, George Soros or whoever, could personally pay out of pocket for every abortion conducted in the country every year. It doesn't add up to all that much. Women who don't get abortions, who have trouble accessing it, who want abortions, sometimes it's financial, but that's not actually the primary thing. And the whole idea of having publicly funded abortions is that it forces people to pay for them. It forces other people to live by your terms.
Right.
It's it's the Roman emperor and the Maccabees. It's you're going to worship at our temple and valorize what we valorize and accept our symbols and accept our cosmology, or you're going to be forced to. That's what all these dumb fights about education are over for the most part. Well, that and the fact that our schools don't work, which probably should enter into the conversation at some point, I mentioned. But we spend a lot of time fighting over
critical race theory being the obvious
it's
example.
Largely symbolic economy.
Right, which is something you just wrote about as well.
Yeah.
So listen, Kevin, we're talked for about an hour already, so I don't want to keep you longer than we discussed, but I want to remind everyone I'm talking with Kevin D. Williamson. He's the author most recently of Big White Ghetto. He's a roving correspondent for National Review. You can find his work on nationalreview.com. Two last questions, Kevin, because I want to keep mindful of your time. So I know you write a lot. You mentioned that you read a lot. Who are you reading right now? What books are you reading? Who captures your attention at the moment?
I don't read a lot of modern stuff.
That's okay.
I've been reading a lot of the history of Tudor England recently. So that's kind of what's been on my bookshelf.
Specific books that you can mention there? Any titles?
Well, the most enjoyable one, I've actually been reading the Wolf Hall novels, which are very, very good.
The which novels? I'm sorry.
Wolf Hall.
Wolf Hall novels.
So these are it's the story of the life of Thomas Cromwell as a work of historical fiction. It's 3 novels. And I've always been sort of anti-Cromwell because I'm a big fan of A Man for All Seasons, in which Cromwell is the villain and Thomas More is the hero. And in Wolf Hall, it's kind of the opposite, where More is this, pious religious fanatic who's eager to burn heretics, and Cromwell is the pragmatist, trying to ensure that the state functions. I have no idea which one of these actually is a better representation of those personalities, but they're both enjoyable reads. So I'm working on a book about idolatry in politics. So some of my reading for that, I've been reading, some religious stuff. I've been reading. So
you're writing a book about this.
Yeah.
I see. Which follows on your piece recently about Joe Biden as priest, right? The piece that you wrote about
that's me working out book stuff in the form of a column. So that'll show up in the book somewhere. So I recently read John Dickerson's book, The Hardest Job in the World, which is a job about the presidency, which is, I disagree with a lot of his analysis, but it's full of interesting anecdotes and such, which is pretty fun.
So you're looking at the imperial U.S. president.
Yeah, Michael Novak wrote a really good book in the 70s called Choosing Our King. And it touches on a lot of the same things that I will be, but it's, kind of written in the immediate wake of Watergate. So it's got a particular, paranoid 1970s flavor to it, which is enjoyable. Schlesinger's The Imperial Presidency is on my desk.
Gotcha. Okay, well, that's a good representation. So last question then for you. What gives you hope? We've talked about a lot of things that are less than hopeful, things that are depressing. What gives you hope?
Well, I'm a long-term, I often describe myself as a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist. And I don't think people want to be miserable or poor or sick or unhappy or oppressed or any of that stuff. And we have a pretty good understanding of how not to be those things. We sort of understand how to cause a society to flourish materially. We sort of understand what's institutionally necessary for a free society. So we can, zigzag around into all sorts of folly and nonsense, but I think that there will always be a core group of people who are pressing to find things in the right direction. I mean, the downside of that is that that doesn't mean it's going to happen here. I think people will find their way toward happiness and prosperity and decency in some part of the world, but it may not be in the United States. But what ultimately gives me hope, I suppose, is that I don't believe that what we do here and now is the end of the story. I'm a religious person. I do believe that we have a higher calling that we answer to, and a bigger reality that we ultimately live in, whether we understand it or not. And that the things that make us unhappy or infuriated or frustrated or whatnot in the present are not necessarily the most important things that we will experience or know. And that I have some faith and trust in that.
Well, let's end it there then. So thanks. So my guest has been Kevin D. Williamson. He's you can find him on the Google. His latest book is The Big White Ghetto. Kevin, thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in next time for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. And until then.
Thanks.
Thank you.